Hello, everyone. I am so glad that you could join me here on this Tuesday night, even though I wish we were together at a convention or at a bookstore where I could feed you donuts or some of this 4 pound jar of jelly beans I've been lugging around hoping to go to a convention. But in any case, we are here for the launch of my new collection, Things That Never Happen. You notice as you look at this book cover how the cover artist perfectly captured my likeness. In fact, as you look at the screen, you're not quite sure which is me, which is the book, which is me, which is the book. I know you're very confused, but we will talk about this in a moment. But let me tell you what we're going to be doing tonight. Well, one thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be giving away three $50 gift certificates that Cemetery Dance Publications, the publisher of Things That Never Happen, has donated, that you could use those in the Cemetery Dance store. Normally, I would hand out raffle tickets and shout numbers, and you'd jump up screaming and run around the room waving your hands like a Muppet. But instead, we're going to have some trivia questions that I'm going to be asking, and hopefully out there are people who will be able to answer those questions. Who knows? It could be Sarah Pinsker. You never know. It could be Damien Kilby. Who knows? Maybe someone will be able to answer those questions. I don't know. Hopefully, it'll be one of the people there. The second thing I'm going to tell you we're going to be doing, in addition to being interviewed by the great Karen Warren, I will interview Lynn Hanson. I am also going to begin dipping into zombie Skittles. In fact, I think I'm going to open this package right now, mixed in with petrifying citrus punch and chilling black cherry. There are zombie flavored Skittles hidden, and I'm just going to be popping these throughout this event. And you may be lucky enough to see me repulse. So I'm going to start with this green one, which could be green or not. Let's see. I'm sorry. It's just melon. I'm sorry. I was not able to be repulsed for you. But in any case, that's some of the things that will be happening tonight as we celebrate the launch of Things That Never Happen, 13 stories of mine. And look at that cover. We're going to start talking about covers here because they say you can judge a book by its cover. I think this cover you really can judge a book by. And one of the reasons this is a wonderful cover is obviously the wonderful Lynn Hanson, who's designed hundreds of covers, is responsible for it. But also, any cover I have had anything to do with or had input on has been a terrible cover and has sent people running away screaming from the book. My first book, These Words Are Haunted, first book, Goya, but people ran screaming from it because they were disgusted by it. We released it with zombie lettering on it, and my publisher tells me that people think it's a kid's book, and every time they see it and learn it's not a kid's book, they put it back down again. Another book I had input on, What Will Come After, where I look like a zombie. No one wanted that, except maybe some friends of mine who wish I really was a zombie. But however, this time, I'll have another one of these. Let's see. No, I'm sorry, it's just cherry. But Things That Never Happened was designed by the great and powerful Lynn Hanson. Let's enter Lynn Hanson to the cheers and applause of the crowd. Hello, Lynn. How are you?
Yay, hello. It's so good to
I'm
be
so
here.
glad to see you. I wish we could be in the same room so I could give you a hug. Now we have to do an elbow bump or something.
You can do you can do virtual hugs. Hold on, wait. Virtual
No.
hugs.
Okay, virtual hugs. Now, one thing I want to say, until I got this actual book in the mail, even though I'd seen the cover, which I had nothing to do with this cover, and that's why it's so wonderful, I noticed inside my head you have a moth with a skull on it. It's a particular kind of moth. Tell me something about this cover and how you read my stories and came up with this idea to represent me, other
Well,
than the physical likeness, that is.
I have very bad news for you, Scott.
Uh-oh.
That is not you.
It is not me.
It
Who
is
is it
not.
then? Is it Jeff
It,
Strand?
it is not Joe Strand.
No?
So, let me tell you a little bit about how this cover came to be. So, um,
Hmm.
I love the work that I get to do for Cemetery Dance. And when Norman Prentice emailed me and said, I want you to do Scott's new collection, I was like, ah, because it was the it's the pressure, because your writing is amazing,
Oh,
and
Scott.
I wanted you to have a cover that that was the very best fit for your book. And so I always read the stories, and I was
I'm so sorry. Actually, that's something many cover artists don't necessarily do that. So I'm glad to hear that you do.
well, I think, to me, it's about, especially with a collection, it's about conveying the style and tone and voice of the work as a whole. And so when I read the very first story, the title story, Things That Never Happened, um, which deals with a woman coming to visit her mother in a nursing home, and her mother doesn't remember her. And one of the things that I don't think a lot of people know about me is that my mom actually had Alzheimer's, and passed away of Alzheimer's about 6 years ago.
I'm
She
sorry.
was in a nursing home, and when I would go to visit her, she would often, as we got further along, she often would remember. She wouldn't remember me, or sometimes she would think that I was one of the aides, and that would make her very happy. um, but what I realized was that I could tell her the same stories over and over again, and she would be entertained and laughed, and we kind of had this reconciliation. And then I read your story, and it was like I have not been able to create art, to write anything, to talk about uh, memory loss and Alzheimer's, any of that, since my mom passed away. It was just really too sore. And the more that when I read more and more of the pieces in in the collection, one of the things that I saw saw a lot of issues with people dealing with loss, with memory loss, with things fading, but also with the fact that people held on to things that they probably didn't need to, whether it was bad memories, bad relationships, too much stuff. And then I thought, how do I represent that in a cover? How how do you show all of these, because there's all these deep issues associated with these stories, and yet they're so mind-blowingly entertaining as well, which I don't think I could have gotten through your collection if it had not been for the fact that, man, you just know how to tell a story. And
Oh, thanks.
and I loved it so much. And so the piece, what I chose was, I also love the fact, hold on, I'm trying to figure out where it goes without blocking me. Oh, there we go, something like this. One of the things I wanted to represent, I like the fact that a lot of the stories dealt with, oh, there we go, that way I don't have to hold anything up. I like that, thank you.
You shouldn't have to work tonight.
But I like the fact that there were, that not every character was a 18-year-old girl, or or like, you had characters that had lives and depth and interest. And so I wanted to create a character for the front of the book that represented someone who had more life and texture to them. And then I thought, well, how do I represent that holding on to things? I actually had an early version of the cover that actually had a woman with almost kind of labyrinth style stuff in her hair, like, everything that she was hoarding and holding on to. And that was just like, that's just too much. And then I thought, because it's not just these memories and these things that they hold on to that cause problems for them, but it's also it puts themselves in a cage. And so that's how I ended up with the cage head. And then I thought, well, how do you represent, what do you put inside the cage to show that they're holding on to things? And so that's where the death's head moth came from, because I wanted to show something that represented death and dying and all of those issues, things flittering in and out. And something that would be a good central point of focus and not take away from the main character. And so that's how the cover came to be. And the fact that she has no face, the fact that she has no face deals with that feeling of loss of memory, loss of self. And I just have to tell you, I was really, really impacted by your book. And I loved it so much. And there's so much that it did for me as well. The piece itself, the art, took me 35 hours.
My goodness.
And I love, it's one of my favorite pieces I've ever done. So thank you for writing an amazing book to inspire it all.
Well, thank you for putting a face on this book to the world. And if there are any writers out there looking to have magnificent covers, you should definitely get in touch with Lynn, because Lynn is a magnificent cover artist. And thank you for joining me here tonight. I will have another Skittle here.
And if folks want to find me, they can find me at Lynn Hanson Art on everything: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and that's my website too, lynnhansonart.com.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to seeing you next year at StokerCon, if we can have a StokerCon in the real world in Denver.
Crossing all the fingers and toes.
See you later. And now what's going to happen next? I'm sorry, I'm just eating berries and melon and orange. I have not yet got the appropriate skill. I have not eaten a zombie skill. You will not see a face in disgust. I want to introduce you to the wonderful Karen Warren, who has been a guest on my podcast. Together we have served fairy bread to the assembled crowd at last year's StokerCon. She's won every possible award in Australian fantasy writing. I think, more than 25 Aurealis Awards and a dozen Ditmars, and et cetera, et cetera. And she's wonderful. And a great novel, Ted of Stone, I love. And here is the wonderful Karen Warren. Hello, Karen. All the way on the other side of the world in Australia.
That's right. It's a nice, bright, sunny morning here, which is why I'm looking very reflective.
You get to have the morning, but I only get to have the night.
That's right. I know. It's this weird middle zone that we're all living in at the moment. That was so, I absolutely loved hearing Lynn talk about that cover, which is just an absolutely stunning cover. And I can see why, when she's talking about her response to your book, which is similar to the response I had, that really comes through that cover, doesn't it?
Oh, I know. I've gotten such tremendously good feedback on it. People have been emailing me and going wow all over Twitter and Facebook, the people who had the initial arcs and the review copies. So I am so pleased that that's the face that's been given to the world, because it's about so many different things. It's not so specific to a single story. It's more about just life in general and the human condition, and that makes it more universal than a particular individual story illustrated would be. But as Lynn said, you can attach it to any one of the individual stories at the same time.
It really is that deep sense of emotion that ran through all of these stories. And I think we'll talk about that as we go along. I've done a little bit of an in-depth series of questions for Scott. Does any of you who've seen his Eating the Fantastic, or any of you have been subject of the of the podcast.
There are no victims in my world.
You know how thoughtful and deep Scott goes into asking his questions and the research he does. So I'm hoping that we can tap in a little bit into that brilliant brain of Scott's as we go along. But so before you give away our first certificate, I thought our first question, I'd like to know what was the genesis of this collection? How did you pull it together, and how did was Cemetery Dance always going to be your publisher? And did the stories come before the publisher? Just give us a little bit of an insight into how the book actually came together.
Well, yes, Cemetery Dance was the publisher I approached, to do the story. I had 13 stories. I basically looked at what I had published that had not been collected, that sort of covered similar themes, sort of otherworldly. One of the things I learned over the years is that many readers can be very particular about mixing certain kinds of horror with certain kinds of fiction, science fiction with certain kinds of fantasy. And while I did not want it to be thematically stale, I wanted to be Twilight Zone-y kind of stories. I don't want to be, I'm too humble to say they're Kelly Linky kind of stories, but they are that kind of looking at the world a few degrees off kilter. And I looked at it, and they seem to work together. They seem to flow one into the next. And they also seem to be of a certain level of quality, because as some writers do, we begin to abandon some certain stories after a while and say, well, this isn't up to my best. This isn't something that I want to represent me, but I felt that I had enough to fill. So that's how these 13 stories came together. And as for the title, I do like titles that are somewhat metafictional. That's where These Words Are Haunted, the title of the first collection, came from, and Things That Never Happened. So it sort of is a title of the story. It's a title of a book. It's also talking about fiction in general.
Yeah, I love it, and I love that title story. But I reckon you should have a giveaway, and then let's start talking about that.
Yes,
story.
let's do a giveaway. Unless have all the questions have fallen to the floor, so my head went off the screen. Yes, we're about 15 minutes into this, so I'm going to ask a question. The way this is going to work, I have a trivia question, and of course, when whoever answers this question first and whose comment comes up in the comment section will get one of the $50 gift certificates good at the Cemetery Dance store. Now, this is a personal question, and it is a question about horror in general. Now, what you may not know, or some of you do know, I am the Susan Lucci of the Horror Writers Association. I am the most nominated writer never to have won a Stoker Award. I am 0 and 8. No one has been nominated more times without having won. But I'm not the biggest loser. If you take into account every writer who's been nominated, who has also won, who has lost more Bram Stoker Awards than any other writer. And now I was supposed to be playing music. I could hum a theme song or something like that. But whoever answers that question appropriately and is going to perhaps delay feeding through from YouTube until I can see it will be the first person to get it. And we'll give it a few minutes, and if no one has the answer to that, we'll move on to some other question. But should we talk about, I know what I'll do. I will eat another Skittle while we wait to see.
I think we can probably just start having the next question, and we can
Sure, keep going.
Yeah. So I really loved Lynn's discussion of this title story, Things That Never Happen, and giving us that sort of her personal response. And I don't have a personal response at that level to it, but certainly have had moments in my life or people in my life that I wish things had gone differently. And that's a little bit what you tap into with this story about the daughter going to her mother and kind of wishing that their relationship had been better and different.
Wait, we have an answer here. Did Norman Prentice stay Stephen King before anyone else? That's the first thing that came through.
It's like it.
Well, Norm, I guess you've got the $50 gift certificate there. Unless, nope. Oh, that's right. Norm, who works for Cemetery Dance Press, says he can't win because he works for Cemetery Dance. Therefore, we're giving it to the person who said that was going to be my guess. Is that really you? Was that Sarah Pinsker who said that? I'm going back to see if that's who that actually is. Well, actually, yes, that's who claimed. Well, that's who the winner is of the first $50 Cemetery Dance gift certificate. And now we will continue on. 15 minutes from now, we'll give away the second one. So let's move on, Karen.
Okie dokie. Yeah, so it's a really sad and really hard story to read in some ways, and the way I've described it is it's perfectly unsatisfying at the end, which sounds like a criticism, but it's actually not. It's a compliment. It was left you feeling very dissatisfied, but in the best possible way. So I wanted to know what was the inspiration for the story to begin with, and also were there any parts of it that you found very hard to write?
Well, the inspiration is a 2 parter. One of the things I do when it's time to come up with another story, I finish a story, I send it off, it's out with editors making a decision. I force myself to come up with ideas for new stories. I have times sit myself down on the couch and say, you may not get up until you come up with 10 nuggets, 10 concepts for stories, not plots, not because a story is something happens and it resolves and so on, but just the conceit of a story. And one of the things that came to me was the concept of someone who has to visit another person who does not remember them, and how do they make that person make amends for what that other person did to them? How do they make that other person feel regret? I don't. There's a supernatural thing that happens in the story. I'll just read briefly, just the opening moments of the story, things that never happen. When Barb, for the first time in years, visited the woman who raised her, she assumed, after all of their tumultuous history together, that she'd see in that wrinkled face a hint of fear, or possibly even some barely suppressed anger, or a trace of irritation at being interrupted. And would remorse have been too much to ask for after how she'd been treated? But instead, the reaction Barb received was as if she'd been a stranger. As the woman in the bed looked up and saw who'd come into her private room, her expression didn't change, not at all. Barb had arrived at the nursing home too late. And then, obviously, since this is not a mimetic story, supernatural and fantastic things happen, and it's revealed who these characters are to each other. And yes, I have had people in my life who have begun to fade away. That's something that I fear. That's one of the reasons I write about zombies from time to time, because I feel in the end that's one of the things we'll all sort of become, someone shambling along, not really being aware of the world around us. So I wouldn't say that it was a hard story to write, not this particular one, emotionally, but it was difficult to make all the components come off. All the subtext, I wanted to make sure you didn't know what was going on until the exact moment I wanted you to know what was happening. Because to my mind, a story is like a time release capsule where each bit of information dissolves at a different time into your brain. You can't know it all at once, and that's really what telling a story is. So as I was sitting there on the couch, that was one of the things that came to me, that I should do a story of someone seeking an answer, seeking resolution, and finding, how do I have this resolution when the person's gone? With all the supernatural elements I will not spoil.
No, as well. But it's a real testament to your skill and experience, is that feeding in of the information. Because working with newer writers, sometimes know that they've got a secret at the end, and you know there's a secret. Whereas with this story, you don't know there's going to be a twist, or you don't know there's going to be a secret, I guess, or a reveal. Don't you think? Part of the skill of being a writer is that the reader doesn't know there's going to be a reveal. With a newer writer, quite often you say, okay, well, you're hiding something from me, and I know you're hiding something from me, so you're just waiting for it. But with this story, it just plays out so naturally.
Well, with all fiction, that's what the thing is, that it's so hard to do. And the ending, when it comes, has to be a total surprise, and it also has to have the reader saying, no, that's exactly what's supposed to happen. And the reader can't be in advance of the character or behind the character, though sometimes there are stories where the reader is smarter than the stupid character, or the other way around. But in most cases, you want the reader and the character to be in pace so the reader doesn't get impatient.
Yes, no, very good. Thank you. So now the next story I thought we'd chat about is the one called The Scariest Story I Know. Now, this one is beautiful and sad, and the other one was sad and beautiful as well. But this is another one of those deeply emotional, very touching kind of stories in this book. You seem to be able to mix horrific things with very deeply emotional and moving things, which is why this book works so well. So this one, you've done different points of view in it, which I know is something that's been done before, and other people have done this. But in your story, I feel like there's a real deliberateness about it, which makes the story work so well. So was there a point where you decided this was the way the story needed to be told? And is it something you either struggle with, or do you find deciding whose point of view you're telling the story from something that comes naturally as in the process?
This was one of the more complicated stories I ever did, in that there are three characters. There's a couple, and you have one told from a first-person point of view and one told from a third-person point of view, and then a child told from a third-person point of view, and you're moving back and forth from one character to the next, and then back out again. And having this work was extremely difficult, to pull off, because obviously every time you switch point of view, particularly in a short story, because people say, oh, don't shift points of view that often in short stories. It's not a thing to do. So, of course, that makes me want to do it. But I had to make sure that the reader understood why it was being done, why a certain character would be first person, a certain character would be third person, the second character would be second person, and all done in a story that I don't even know if it was more than 4,000 words. It was a short one. And one of the things I like best about this particular story is it was purchased without the editor knowing who I was. There was a British magazine called Anonymous, in which the editor would only read stories anonymously, find out who you were when he bought the story, and publish them anonymously. So this annual book anthology would come out with no bylines. And I think one of them, he finally had a list of authors in the back of the book, and you had to guess which author matched which story. And the funny thing was, on this particular one, this story published anonymously probably got the best reviews of any story that I had up until that point in time, because I think reviewers were tempted by the idea of figuring out who wrote these anonymous stories, so they investigated each one very closely. But yeah, a shift in point of views was difficult to pull off. And again, that's a meta-fictional kind of title, The Scariest Story I Know. So again, I really struggle with, well, actually, I won't say I struggle with titles. I care about titles, and sometimes come up with 40 or 50 different titles before I settle on the one that I think best shows off the story.
Yes, it's really an interesting thing, isn't it? Like, the title needs to be at the very heart of your story. That title needs to sum up a story. And sometimes I find when I get to the end of a story and figuring out the title, I realise what my story's about, which I hadn't realised until I figured out the title.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, and then sometimes I think I have a perfect story title, and then I write the story and say, oh no, that's the title for a different story. It no longer represents, it might represent the plot of the story, but not the emotional context of the story.
No, I know. And sometimes, sometimes you've got that title that's just so good, but the story, I just can't, like, I've just had one I've had to let go. I'll save it for something else, but I'm not going to tell you what it is, because you steal it. I know.
I'm having so much fun talking to you that I'm forgetting to eat any Skittles, so I'm going to pop another one just because I know they're all out there waiting.
Funnily enough, my next one is a food question, and I've got to note to myself, pop a Skittle. So you better keep eating.
No, I'll pop another.
So this is
guys.
This is a visitor or a Facebook question. And it's away from your stories, but Mike Zipser wanted to know about restaurants that you have missed out on this year, or that you are, in a more positive note, anticipating going to next year.
Well, there are two things I will point out. Since many of us were supposed to be in New Zealand last month at the World Science Fiction Convention, Con Zealand, and there were two things I was very much looking forward to. One, I found a New York-style deli called Pickle and Pie, where I was going to go get a Reuben sandwich, because it fascinates me when other nations attempt to replicate foods not of their particular culture. So when we were in Helsinki for the Helsinki Worldcon, I tracked down the only Texas barbecue joint in Helsinki because I wanted to see, did they do it? They had everything shipped over from Texas that they could use, sausages from Louis Mueller and things like that. They did a great job of it. So I was very interested in taking someone out for that particular one to recording episode of my podcast. The second thing I learned about New Zealand, not a specific restaurant, but I was very disappointed. One of the things I do for Eating the Fantastic is that once a year, I do a donut episode where I get a dozen donuts, go to a convention, put them out on the table, say, talk to me for 5 minutes, and you get a free donut. I did one at Grand Rapids with donuts. Well, someone in New Zealand told me at the Nebulas last year, they said, oh, we don't do donuts in New Zealand. That's not really a thing that excites us. Really? You don't do donuts in New Zealand? I said, no. I said, well, so what do you do if you're going to the office and you want to show up with a surprise to make everybody happy? You don't bring donuts. I said, no, we bring sausage rolls. So
Right.
that's what this New Zealander claimed. So I was going to have to record an episode with sausage rolls. I'm being
Gosh.
asked whether I found a zombie Skittle last year. When I gave these out, no one ever got a zombie Skittle. I went through half the bag. No zombie Skittles, no Scream. I'm sorry. Maybe it'll never happen. I'll just keep trying. But that's about it.
Oh, look,
For
sausage
food.
rolls, there's a vast, there's probably New Zealanders and Australians would have arguments about what's the best sausage roll as well. They claim theirs the
That's
best.
true. Well, had it actually happened, I would have done a further investigation for who makes the
Well,
best sausage rolls in
homemade
Wellington.
ones as well. The homemade sausage rolls are very good. And there's a place called Elaine's close to me that I reckon do the best sausage rolls in the world. So we'll have to take you on a sausage roll tour of the Antipodes next
Someday.
Wednesday.
And there's probably a New Zealand versus Australia war. You're right.
Well, there certainly is. As far as meat pies go, like we're famous for the meat pie thing as well, which I don't know if elsewhere in the world. And I actually do think that New Zealanders' meat pies are better than ours. I'm going to be on the record with that. Okay. Anyway,
so we'll give another certificate in about 5 more minutes for those who are. We'll keep going for another 5 minutes. Then.
Oh, good. I think that'll work out well. So the next story I thought we'd talk about is Petrified, which is another. I love this story as well. And this one is about a couple basically who hate each other's guts and are pretending they don't anymore. As a very simple summary with all sorts of other amazing things happen in this story. I absolutely loved it. So this one really brought to mind how do you separate yourself from your characters? Because given your long and very happy marriage,
44 years, just a couple of weeks ago.
And how do you write such a totally dysfunctional and very unloving couple when your experience is the absolute opposite?
Well, I will say that, first of all, writing is acting. And actors play a variety of characters, and you must inhabit a variety of different kinds of people. You're not writing people who are alike except for the basic humanity. But in this particular story, once I decided what the story had to be, I had to go with it and imagine what these characters were like. I will just read a brief piece of this because these characters really do not get along. This is a story called Petrified. I wrote it to appear in the program book at a World Horror Convention. I believe it was in Utah when they put out a call for stories set in the desert, and I had this idea for a couple visiting the petrified forest, and their marriage was also petrified. So I'll just do a brief reading from this particular story so you can see what kind of people these people are. This is the husband's point of view in this particular place. I wanted to spend our week away camping in the mountains, rising early on crisp mornings for hiking and fishing. Elaine wanted to spend our time together at the beach with mojitos in hand, baking in the sun. We split the difference, which meant that we ended up with a plan to spend 7 days together driving through the desert. How stupid was that? I don't care what Father says, how many times he tried to indoctrinate us that meeting in the middle was the only way to go. Compromise is never the way to go. Whenever the two of us would try, neither of us ended up happy. Both of us ended up resentful, so what's the point? We already knew how to achieve misery on our own without his advice. As we drove straight from the airport toward Petrified Forest National Park, our first day in Arizona, I looked sourly at the endless, blinding nothing which surrounded us. Our rental car's air conditioning sputtered fitfully as I sped through the Badlands. Red sand split in two by an endless ribbon of black road. Nondescript mesas to the left, mind-numbing buttes to the right, or was it the other way around? I glanced from the vista framed by the windshield to the smaller one displayed in the rearview mirror. Where we were heading didn't seem so different from what we had left behind. Would have been nice to have seen something green, I grumbled. Would have been nicer to have sat by something wet, she whined. Grumbles and whines, those were our usual methods of communication. We were 1,000 miles from home, and yet it was as if we'd never left. That wasn't quite the result Father promised when he proselytized about the power of compromise. Compromise was one of those touchy-feely tools of his that was supposed to pull us back from the brink. It sure didn't feel that way so far. Instead, it looked like it might just push us both over the edge. And when I say writing is acting, once you've decided those are the characters you're dealing with, and that's the situation they're in, and they're stuck in a Twilight Zone-y kind of situation, you just go with it. So it is a false thing, as you know very well, Karen, that people will say, you wrote about an axe murderer. Obviously, you must have axe murderer tendencies. And all of these things are about you. Or, you mentioned a grandfather in a story. Obviously, that's your own grandfather you're making commentary on. But no, we're actors as much as actors are actors.
We just bring elements of our own experience, I guess,
Yes.
to it. For me, that makes me think of long car rides through Western Australia, which it feels like that road goes on for absolutely forever.
I know, and they say hell is other people, but it depends who you're with, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Really, with the right person, it is not hell. But I think I'm going to give away another $50 gift certificate. I think we're going to move to horror movies now. This is a horror movie question. So whoever is the first person to answer this one correctly will get a $50 gift certificate good at the Cemetery Dance store. Cemetery Dance, who are the publishers that have brought us all together because they have published things that never happened. And this story, what was the first American movie to show a toilet on the screen and the first in which we hear a toilet being flushed? Who can tell me the answer to that one? And of course, in this real world, I know you're all tippy-tapping with your keyboards trying to see if you can find the answer, but maybe someone knows this and will be the first one to answer this question. I will pop one more. Phil, just to vamp for time. Another melon one. No, this is not happening to everybody's satisfaction.
We're going to have you tipping a whole lot down your gullet soon.
But then you wouldn't know. Okay, here.
No,
of course,
nothing.
the members of the audience with misophonia, this would put them off because there are people who are triggered by chewing sounds. I've learned this from Eating the Fantastic. There's some people who don't listen because, 70 or 80% of the people with misophonia. Wait, who was it? Wait, someone has the correct answer.
I think it looks like Jeff was first.
It looks like Jeff Strand was the first one to pop up. That it was indeed Psycho was the first amendment. A couple of other people had the answer as well, but they were split seconds later in terms of popping up. Unfortunately, we don't have runner-up prizes, so Jeff is going to be getting that. Thanks, Jeff. See, Jeff knows this because he has been in that shower and has sometimes dresses like Norman Bates. So that's probably how he was able to come up with that. Thank you, Jeff, and thanks for the others who were almost quite there. Oh, Jeff goes woohoo. Woohoo, Jeff. Now, where were we, Karen? Before I'll pop another one and I'll keep going.
All right. Well, look, this segues very cleverly into me saying the lucky ones. Let's talk about your story, the lucky ones. Speaking of people who are lucky and otherwise. Now, I really love this one as well. It's quite surreal. It involves someone called Uncle Neil and old magazines. And it really appealed to me because I'm completely obsessed with old magazines. I just love them. I love the fact that you can pick up an old magazine and it's like looking into the future because you can read an article about somebody and then Google them and you know what happened 20 years into the future. And I really find that quite fascinating. So there's certainly a key element in this one. What I wondered about this one was there a certain place that inspired this story? Was there a certain moment that inspired it?
Well, this is a personal story, as was that Perilous Stuff also. Both of them had somewhat hoarding tendencies in there. I had an uncle, Uncle Jack, without whom I would not be here today. He would visit us when I was a kid. Every Friday night, he'd bring over a sack full of old magazines and a sack full of books and a Ebbinger's chocolate cake. Those of you who are New Yorkers would know what Ebbinger's chocolate cake was. And I just would read more magazines than my allowance could possibly have gotten on my own. And he died a hoarder. He died in his stuff. In fact, we weren't allowed into his house. At the end, after he died, the police just sort of shut it down as a toxic zone with ropes around it. Basically, everything I have of his is in a shoebox. What little they could recover that wasn't considered toxic. And I had this idea of someone like that who, was attempting to erase himself from your life, from your timeline, sort of, so that you could have a future that wouldn't end up that way. And so that was sort of me trying to give someone like that a better future than the real world timeline ended up giving him. So some of that ended up in there, without giving away too much about the story.
Exactly. I mean, I certainly do that too. There's people that I've tried to give better endings to. It really took me. There's a certain shop an antique shop, and then upstairs, I think on the 3rd floor or something, there was a little attic room, and
and this is sort of an inverse story, actually.
Sorry, yeah. In what way? Sorry.
Oh, well, compared to the Petrified story you were talking about, where it had a horrible family life, this one begins with a husband and wife and 2 kids just having the time of their lives and stopping for ice cream in a small town, and you could tell they obviously all get along and love each other until the guy accidentally sees a magazine and starts having weird, seemingly suppressed memories and has to figure out what was going on.
Right.
So.
Series at the old magazine ads as well. Actually.
So I see there's a comment, useful relative, sad ending, said Todd Mason. And one of the things I like to think about this particular book, I know that Publishers Weekly gave me a wonderful review. I am so thrilled. And they commented on how, the book was filled with abusive relatives or distant relatives or cold mothers or so forth. And I prefer to think of it as a book of people who survive those things for the most part. So that's my point of view. If you look, you can either look at it and say it's a story about, the abusers, or you can say it's a story about the survivors of that who managed to sometimes have happier lives. So that's the way I look at it.
Well, that segues very well into the next story I wanted to talk about, survival of the fittest. Now, I wanted to know, this one in particular, I wanted to know if this was inspired by your travels. Like, I'm fascinated how people are influenced by their environment, about where they're living and where they've travelled to. And also, how has this year of lockdown affect your writing? So how much are you affected by travel and seeing new environments in your stories? Like, do you need them for inspiration? And
well, this particular story is set on the Galapagos Islands, which my wife and I went to for our 25th anniversary. And all of the detail in there is as good as I could make it. Hopefully I am accurate, though I'm sure if someone who is a native there or who visits far more often than I do will say, oh, you got this part or that part wrong about the albatross, about sea lions, and so forth. But one of the fascinating things I went to is visiting the cemetery in the Galapagos Islands for the people who live there. And I had this idea of a man whose spouse has passed, who's returning to do a particular thing and move through that environment. This came up, this was written, and I very rarely come up with things when people say, can you write me something for an anthology? Stephen Jones was doing a book called Summer Chills, and he wanted to have vacations sites. And it's, look, I've had too many things set in London, too many things set in the major cities of the world. Can someone come up with something that's a little more unusual? And so I went for the Galapagos Islands. And I don't know that I necessarily would have gotten to that story without that particular prompt. Even though I go to these places, I don't always write about those places, and the ideas that come from those places aren't always about those places, if that makes sense. But in this particular case, it was very much set in the Galapagos Island, which is as close to the Garden of Eden as I think a person can get in this world. If you can step up to a tree full of birds, and the birds do not care that you are standing up next to the tree, and you can just look at them from a few inches apart, and they'll look at you and they'll tilt their head back and forth, because no one on those islands is allowed to do anything. Usually you have a guide to 10 people, and if you were to attempt anything, you'd be booted off the island. So they are not trained to have a recoil thing, except for the tortoises, because they are so old, I believe, that they remember what it was like 100 years ago, and they are not happy to see people. Everything else, they don't care. You'll step over a nest, and the bird will just look up at you as you step over them and not attempt to get away. So, and as to what's going on in the apocalypse in which we are living, it is very difficult for me to write stories in which things turn out well for the human race. So a lot of the stories are darker, or if they're science fiction stories, they might be taking place in a world where artificial intelligence and robots survive, and they might have happy endings, but not for humans, for these other things as well. So I'm finding, that difficult, to come up with. So
I think a lot of people are feeling similarly, and certainly less external input is occurring, isn't it?
I'm in deep lockdown here. I hope everyone out there listening feels safe and is taking care of themselves. That's the most important thing. We shall meet again someday in the future, and I will be able to offer you donuts or offer you jelly beans, which do not have disgusting zombie flavored jelly beans.
Speaking of which, have another go. Let's see if we can get that zombie.
Okay, here, we'll do one. That nice cherry.
Oh, cherry's pretty disgusting. I don't like that flavor.
You know what the problem might be? What if I actually like zombie flavors? I've written so many zombie flavors. What if I eat a zombie one and I just say, oh, gee, that tastes great?
Well, normally
I may be impervious.
Melon flavor, so maybe he would have thought the melon was the zombie one.
Okay, I'll have one more.
So speaking of things that are scary, so I want to ask you about the next story is called It's Only a Story. And this one and the other one called The Scariest Stories I Know are obviously and funnily enough about scaring people. So I want to know what scares you, Scott Edelman.
What scares me? Well, one of the things that I've written about all over. When I'll look around and won't recognize you, this is the story that I wrote. The title story, What Will Come After, is said in future tense and talks about me in the future having turned into a zombie when I'm stumbling around my own house, knocking pictures off the wall, which I have no idea they're pictures or who they are, knocking my books down, I don't know what they are, and so forth. So that's the thing that I think is the most frightening, the loss of the brain, not necessarily the loss of the body or the weakening of the body as we go down the hill toward the other side, but the loss of ability. Hopefully, one of my great role models is a writer, Jack Williamson. He made it to 98 3/4. He was with it until the end. I saw him about 6 months before that, except for going deaf and needing to be in a wheelchair now and then. He was with it. He could tell stories. He was writing and publishing. I think he's the oldest person ever to have won either Nebula or Hugo. I'm losing track now. And he cared about this field. He cared about the community. He was always interested in what new writers were doing, and was very humble. So when I look at the people who go before, I hope I will end up like that and hang in for the long haul and see the glorious future of the literature, the fantastic around us.
One of the things I really love about you is you're so warm and engaged with the people around you, and I guess that's what you're talking about in that fear is losing that ability to connect and losing the memories. Like a lot of what you have is your memories of meals and conversations and working with people. It seems to be what in part drives you as a person, is all that. So I can see why that. It's a fear for me too. I totally connect to that concept of that fear of losing that memory, of losing why, losing the memory of why you care for somebody, or those small moments. Like I remember you popping up in Brighton at the World Fantasy in Brighton. I was walking along with Ellen Clages, and you kept popping up from cars, like you'd run ahead and hide behind a car and pop up, hi, as if, we're seeing you for the first time. And that's like I just love that little memory of you, and I'd hate for that to go away. I'd hate for that little memory of your face popping up, being funny, to go away.
Well, I hope to be coming around for years to come. Actually, I would say the one thing that I fear the most at the moment will be happening in November, but let's steer away from that topic because that will take us in all sorts of different directions. So,
now, you had a reading from that story, didn't you? I'm not even going to respond to that. So you were going to do a little reading from that. It's Only a Story, weren't you?
Yeah, I'll do a brief reading from this story as well. This was a story that was written for the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein. It's called It's Only a Story. And as you know, the story ended up getting written when a bunch of people, including Mary Shelley, were sitting around saying, "Hey, let's all come up with scary stories." And I sort of molded that to a Stranger Things kind of young kids in the suburbs on bicycles having a little adventure. And I've got 3 kids here who are sitting around bored with their lives and decide to tell each other stories. One is into gaming, one is into comic books, and one is into scary movies. And I'll just read a section of this. "This is boring," said Biff. "Killing those guys has gotten too easy. I mean, I've smashed them with a hammer like a million times already." Ron tilted his head back and looked at his upside-down friend. His eyeglasses slid to his forehead, and his friend grew fuzzy. "Yeah, and I've read this one too many times already," he said, pushing the lenses back up to his nose. "If it wasn't so late, we could make a run to the comic shop, but it's already closed." Johnny cut off the sound on his horror movie and let the monsters fight on in silence. He smiled in the flashing light of the screen. "And I already know who's going to win when Reptilicus finally gets around to fighting Aptoctopus," he said. They sat without speaking for a few uncomfortable moments until Biff, always the first one for action, piped up. "So what are we going to do about it?" No one answered, but then Johnny smiled. "I have an idea," he said. "Why don't we try to all come up with our own horror stories?" Biff looked at Ron. Ron looked at Biff. And then they both looked back at Johnny. "Great idea," said Biff. "You first." "No, that's not why they..." "Hey, it was your idea," added Ron. Glad it looked like he wouldn't have to be the one to start. He dropped his comic. It wasn't one of the valuable ones. Those never left his own bedroom. And turned to place his back against the wall. Johnny looked nervously around the room with no idea how to begin. He forced his hands deep into his pockets so he wouldn't feel compelled to chew his fingernails again. His mind was a blank as he gazed about until his eyes fell on the controller Biff had tossed aside. Then slowly, haltingly, he began to speak. There was this factory, see, where this company made computer games," he said, "and the bosses were horrible, almost as bad as the big boss monsters in the games. They wouldn't let the workers take any breaks, not to eat, not to go to the bathroom, not even to sleep." "Not even to sleep," repeated Biff, uncertain whether it was interrupting because the story made no sense or because it made too much sense. He read the articles, too. "Well, they had to sleep in the factory and were allowed just enough sleep to be able to keep working," continued Johnny. "But barely that. And so some died from exhaustion. Some got lonely and depressed because they couldn't see their families. They went up to the factory roof and jumped off and killed themselves. And though the bosses took the bodies away, the souls of the workers, they stayed behind. And because they hated the people who bought the games, who they felt, because they wouldn't have to make them if no one bought the games they made, right? Were the real bosses behind the bosses who'd killed them, their spirits went into the games. And every once in a while, those spirits can get out, reach out and take over who's playing." Ron looked over at Biff, who was the best gamer of the 3, expecting him to break into the story again, but his friend's intense expression told him no. "So one day there's kids playing and there's a spark. See, a short circuit, I guess, and suddenly the kid's inside the game and he loves it. And he goes around killing zombies, many zombies, endless zombies. And then he killed the big boss too, the zombie king over all the other zombies. And so, see, he wins the game. And then right when the game's over, it all fades away, the world within the game. And he suddenly sees he was never in a game at all. He was always in the real world, our world. It was a lie, so he hadn't been killing zombies after all. He killed his friends, all of his friends. And so he gets locked up, and his parents throw the kid's console away, and you think that would be the end of it. But then some other kid finds it in the trash or maybe the yard sale, and what happened to the first kid happens to him too. And is this story going anywhere?" asked Ron. "No, wait, let me think. I'll figure out an ending. Just give me a second." "That wasn't scary," said Biff. "Not scary at all." "Oh, you think you could do better?" said Johnny. And basically every one of these kids ends up telling each other a story, and they meet a new kid in the neighborhood, and things get really weird when that kid tells a story. And so that was my attempt to channel a whole bunch of kids who were too much into horror material. So I think
Yes.
we've spoken for quite a while. I think we should give away the final $50 gift certificate. And if you've answered before, hold back so one of the other people can answer. Now, what famous inventor was the producer of the first film version of Frankenstein? I bet one of you knows that off the top of your head.
Interesting.
I'm gonna pop. Oh no, orange. No. Someone says Reptilica's always too easy. Says too easy. Says Lynn. Well, good thing you can't compete then. No. I may be invulnerable. I might be invulnerable to zombie Skittles. Right? Todd Mason seems to be the first person that popped through. It says Edison. Yes, that is right. The Edison Corporation. Thomas Edison was the producer of the first Frankenstein filmed version in 1910. And I should point out that all of you people who have won things should, through YouTube, message me, or through Twitter, or through any means you like. Send me your contact information so I can forward it to Cemetery Dan so they can go ahead and give you the information on how to redeem that. So where are we, Karen, now? I know I don't want to keep people longer than an hour, so we maybe 10 minutes more, and then we'll let them all go.
I've got lots more, and then we'll keep an eye. If anyone's got any questions they want me to ask Scott, pop them down in the comments there, and I can squeeze them in.
Yes, and as well, I foolishly forgot to point out that if you're on YouTube and look at the description below, you will find the order information. How could I not have mentioned that at the very beginning for both the ebook and the trade paperback version of Things That Never Happened? So you can read it however you wish. And yes, Karen, tell us more. Pepper me with more questions.
I do have. Well, do you want another question about another story, or would you like to tell us about the mushrooms in your backyard?
No, people don't want to hear about it. If they want to hear about the mushrooms in my backyard, they could follow me on Twitter or something like that. Let's talk more about writing.
This, okay, so we've sort of talked about this one. I don't know. I can't decide which one to ask you for. Okay, let's do this one. We'll go in order. Becoming invisible. Now, this one is as nasty as they come and goes to a lot of places that other authors wouldn't necessarily take a story to. So tell us, what are your feelings on the extremes in fiction, and how do you make yourself go forward? How do you make yourself go to those places? How do you write the really dark stuff?
Well, I will say that something I read by Ted Sturgeon a long time ago, and he was talking about shoe fetishists, of all things. And what he said about shoe fetishes, this is Ted Sturgeon, said, a shoe fetishist loves loving shoes. It's just love. It's just a love like any other love. It's just that's the thing they love. So once you are inhabiting a person from the inside, however bizarre someone else might seem from the outside, if you were in that person's point of view, is a natural and beautiful and wonderful thing. This particular story, and I don't want to necessarily give away the spoiler because it takes you a little bit getting into the story to know what's going on with the story. But one of the things that's important to me about any situation is you have to figure out who would be most hurt or impacted or confused or damaged by this change you imagine in the world. So often I will say, okay, such and such a thing happens. That's not a story. That's just a concept. You have to say who is hurt by this. And so once I decided on that particular story, the thing that is happening in the world, I then had to think, okay, who could this impact? And there's someone with a very particular fetish, shall we say, who is impacted. And that's how that story came about. I don't want to give away all of it, but yes, but it was probably the most extreme and the most explicit of the stories. I don't think of it as a bizarro story. I don't think of myself as a bizarro writer.
No, it's definitely extreme though.
But it is just extreme based on what this person's particular fetish is. And it was a very long story. It's about 20,000 words. It's the longest story in the book. And I see there's a question here from my old pal Gene O'Neill, who I went to Clarion with in 1979. 41 years ago. Oh my goodness, how is that possible? Is this a horror story? It's a story that was a story that I published a long time ago in Pulp House, edited by Dean Wesley Smith and Christine Catherine Rush. They were both doing that. And that was a story, Is This a Horror Story? In which it was actually based on something that happened in my life where I uncovered evidence of someone with an unusual interest in children, shall we say, hidden in part of my mother-in-law's house. We discovered while going through the light and pushed up part of the ceiling and discovered a package of photos up there. And as I looked through the photos, I ended up having to call the police. And luckily, the person had left a letter from the Motor Vehicles Bureau in with the photos. And when the officer came, the detective came, he said, well, I can't tell you anything about anything other than the fact that I recognize the name on that Motor Vehicles Bureau letter. And we are very glad to have this package. So that ended up being a story that I ended up reading based on that. Yeah, an old pal Danny Fingerworth wants to know who's stronger, Aunt May or Aunt Man. Obviously, Aunt May, because I don't care what happens in any comic book. She is immortal as far as I'm concerned. So what? We have a long comment here about Ted Sturgeon. Yes, well, that's probably true. A comment about James Blitch's response to Sturgeon. That would have made it more difficult to write the story if I believed as Blitch did rather than as Sturgeon did. That I just sort of felt we love what we love and make no apologies for it.
You have to write those stories from a position of understanding. I think if you point of view that character, you've got to try and understand that character to a large extent, don't you?
Yes. Well, I appreciate. Do we have one last question from either you or any members? Yeah, someone wants to know, will a horror story about dealing with YouTube be in the works? Well, it all depends how pixelated I am when I go back and look at this for you being with me. I thank you all for being with me. Do we have any last thing I could answer?
Lynn says, what are you working on next?
Yes, well, as we're winding down, I'm going to bring Lynn back so we're all here. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Karen, for all of this. What am I working on next? I have a story idea that I am now attempting to find the character meant to be part of the story. Because as I said, that's always the hardest thing. You come up with a conceit. I have one I said, I don't remember reading a story in this setting with this concept before. And I read very widely. Of course, it's impossible to do anything new. Now I have to figure out who the character is meant to be to write this story. And one of the things for all you writers out there, all you people who are at the beginning of writing, because I don't have to teach Karen or Lynn anything, but I often sit down and make a list of 20 or 30 different people. Who is this about? Is this about this woman, this man, someone someone who doesn't identify, someone who does identify, regardless of race, color, gender, sexuality, fluidity, or anything, age, whatever it happens to be, nationality, circumstances of life, riches, lack of money. Who is this meant to be? As I said earlier, who hurts, who doesn't hurt, who would this impact the most? So that's a long thing, and I go through it, and I go through it, and I go through it, and eventually. I say I will not get up until I've listed 20 or 30 different characters, and finally one will go, it's this person's story. And that's how I arrive at the story. And I just have an idea, which I will not, and I don't talk about stories in progress. And I don't mention, Lynn, by the way, what the story is about, because I'm afraid of people stealing stories. There's no stealing of stories. There are just so many stories in the world. No one's going to steal a story. I am a tea kettle or something. The minute I talk about it, it goes away. If I were to tell you I have this great idea for a story, I'd never write it. Peter Straub, the great Peter Straub, and I are like pantsers versus plotters. I once heard him say, as soon as I know what's on the other side of the crevasse, I have no need to build a bridge to it. And I feel the same way. Once I start talking, I don't even know what the story's about till the end of the second draft or third draft. So anyway, we have been together here for an hour. I thank you both for joining us. I thank you all out there in the audience thank you so much Karen, for peppering me. See, because I have eaten the fantastic. I'm thinking about food all the time and peppering.
Me too. I'm hungry. I haven't had breakfast yet.
Thank you, Lynn, for this magnificent cover, which, okay, I'm not going to say as a self-portrait anymore, but I will still joke about that many times. When Halloween comes, I will just take the book and I will tie it to my face and not go out, because we're not going out. I hope you all stay safe out there. Thank you for joining me at this launch. I hope the world returns to some sense of normality sometime, so we can meet in the flesh at a convention. I could give you donuts, I can give you sausage rolls or jelly beans, and we can all sit in a room and enjoy this wonderful community of the fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Scott.
Everyone,
Thanks,
be safe and be well, and take care of yourself.